Welcome to episode 3 of Roose's Book Club. I am Ryan Robertson, Parent Chief, the founder and director of Future Leaders.
And I am Sierra Burrows, one of the day one members, note taker, script writer.
So welcome, Sierra. Glad to have you on the show with us, co-hosting with me today.
Good to be here with you, Roy.
Thank you. So just to jump into today's show, just a quick recap from last episode. We talked all about The West and the Rest of Us by Chinwezu Ibekwe. So we started off with addressing some of the community violence and some of the tragedies we've faced over the last couple of weeks, months, years. And we talked a little bit about how we must first ground ourselves in understanding some of the root causes of the issues instead of jumping directly into finding solutions. And Chinwezu's book was all about the history of colonialism, our people, black people, African people, pre-colonization, the third world generally. We talked a little bit about how the Western world has sort of shaped recent history. And we thought that was very important in terms of how we start with Roose's Book Club, because before we even talk about Bermuda and some of the solutions and some of the challenges, we need to first start with where this all stemmed from, which is hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and the disruption that's taken place. So Chinwezu highlighted how colonization systematically undermined Africa's political autonomy, economic independence, and cultural integrity. We came away with a little bit of an understanding of how colonization has manifested itself in those three areas being the political/social, the economic, cultural, and how our problems are caused by a system that never intended to center what we need to grow and develop as a people. So therefore, we have to start unlearning that history and the ideas and ideologies taught to us from a Western lens before we even talk about what we're going to do. So ultimately, Chinwezu talked about how black leadership had failed in being true leaders post-colonization by failing to deliver on some of the promises and maintaining and adopting Western ideologies, abandoning those African traditions and that cultural context, and distancing themselves from the common people. It created a segment of black elites that only concerned themselves with maintaining their power and building wealth. So that was sort of the backdrop to what Sam and I talked about a few weeks ago. But Sierra, I know you were tuning in, so why don't you add a little bit on what your takeaway was from a listener's perspective on that last episode of Radical Unlearning?
I think that it was a really great discussion because you guys really unpacked, like you said, how did we get here? Not just looking at how we learned about it in history as far as World War I and World War II, but really looking at what was being fought for, what the resources that were being fought over, how that affected us, and then how that translates into modern systems and the way that we view society today, and how that also impacts how we think about how we show up in society and what we're all striving towards. We had a caller that called in as well, and he gave his 2 cents about how it's not just political, it's not just economic, but it's also mental. And as we talked about, or as you and Sam talked about last week, we have to really unlearn and unpack those things so that we're clear about how we move forward with these solutions, which leads us into the book that we're discussing today.
Okay, so we'll jump into, in a little while, that next book that we're moving on to, but I want to be clear that Chinwezu's book is hundreds of pages long, and those 2 episodes don't cover it, right? So even in those last 2 episodes, we didn't go into every single chapter. We only covered really the intro and some excerpts from chapters 1, 2, 5, 10, and chapter 11. And the reason we got up to chapter 11 was because what we thought at that stage, the key takeaway was colonialism manifested itself in 3 particular areas of life, and that is the economic area, the political area, and the cultural area. So we heard, like you just mentioned, some callers talking about the toll it takes on us psychologically and all the rest, but we aren't done with Chinwezu's book. No. We will be coming back to it. So for those of you that are seeking to not just listen and engage, but also read on your own, go ahead and pick up The West and the Rest of Us by Chinwezu. Get a head start on reading some of the other chapters because we will come back to it. But for now, we're moving on to episode 3, which ties in. This episode is called Radical Heritage. And I'm going to turn it back over to Sierra to sort of introduce what that book is and why we thought moving on from The West and the Rest of Us, moving into this book, was appropriate for this time.
Once we understand the systems that were created as or birthed out of those different world wars and how we see society today, you also see how leadership has evolved over time. In particular, when Black leadership evolved, the concerns that were prioritized at that time shifted into maintaining power and building wealth, as opposed to maybe undoing the harm that was done to us psychologically, socially, economically, and culturally. And that leads us into our new topic, Radical Heritage, where we'll be diving into the second book on our list, which is called The Experience of Racism in Bermuda and Its Wider Context, Reflections by Dr. Eva Hodgson. This is a really cool book, and it was my first time reading it when we set up the book club. And essentially, it's a combination of personal and political reflections. And she details the systems used to uphold oppressive conditions of racial inequality that we see in present-day Bermuda. The book helped us to understand the oppressive history of racism in Bermuda and how it's implemented at a systemic level. Just a little bit about Dr. Hodgson herself. She was a Bermudian educator, a writer, an activist, a truth teller, and some might then have called her a troublemaker. But when you study her life, she was a teacher by profession, and she spent a large portion of that career in the classroom, both locally and abroad. But she was also a member of the the Progressive Labour Party from its formation. And even though she never ran for political office herself, she often criticized the party for its compromises and falling away from what they said that they were about. But we are going to get into that later on. But she was also a member of organizations like Citizens Uprooting Racism in Bermuda, whose general counsel she served on. And in exploring the question of how did we get here, racial inequality is a topic that has to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is a very special book for me. Believe it or not, I have to give a shout out to my aunt, Shirley Swan, one of my church aunties, because this book, I don't think it's in print anymore, The Experience of Racism in Bermuda and in Its Wider Context. It was actually published alongside the government of Bermuda and CURE, the Commission for Unity and Racial Equity, in 2008. And I was 12 at the time, and one of my church aunties gave me this book, and it doesn't have any pictures. Like, it's just text. Like, Dr. Hodgson just went in and just compiled some of her thoughts and essays and different research areas. And I remember being 12, and I was like, what is this? What am I going to do with this book? But years later, I came around to it, and I was like, all right, Aunt Shirley, I see what you was doing there. I see what you was doing. So it's a very special book to me. That's why I have it here. It's all beat up. It's very old. Yeah. But it's very important because, like you're saying, Ciara, what Dr. Hodgson did in this book was sort of take a summary of her life's work, of the dissertations and the essays and the academics, tied it into that global historical context, but put it in the Bermuda perspective and really jumped into, if you look at the table of contents, she just goes into, she says the Bermuda experience, segregation, immigration, emigration, apartheid, employment, entertainment. And she really just goes into different areas of life, education. And she just breaks down how racism has had a role in Bermuda in that particular area, right? So what I think we can talk a little bit about, is sort of Dr. Eva Hodgson's definitions of racism, because I think in Bermuda today, there are a lot of people that still say there's no racism in Bermuda. There's no such thing as colonialism because there was nobody here when Bermuda was ironically colonized. We still say the word, right? We say that because Bermuda's majority black, there's no racism, or because we have a black quote-unquote government, there's no racism. So I think it would be important for the audience and for us engaging in Roose's Book Club to sort of give a little bit of context into what we mean when we talk about racism. Right. And then we can jump a little bit into some examples of how it still manifests today, because that ties in, following from the West and the rest of us, where we're seeing how that has trickled down into society today. So Do you want to start with some of the definitions that Dr. Hodgson talks about when we talk about racism?
Some people in Bermuda today still don't think that racism is a thing, but I think another issue is that you see people grabbing onto these examples of racism in terms of police brutality or microaggressions, which is not the same when we talk about Bermuda. I think that's the focus of today. We're talking about the experience of racism in Bermuda and not drawing from the U.S. And, because that tends to be a tendency as well, comparing how much better or worse it is in comparison to states. And, and this is Bermuda.
Like, because we don't have any viral videos of like police brutality or the N-word being called out. I mean, obviously it still happens and pops up.
It does still happen.
And only then do people say, oh, wow, racism's alive and well. But I think like what you're saying, it's not just direct incidences of prejudice or expression of discrimination. Racism is a system. It's a system, right? So I mean, in the book, she talks about institutional racism, structural racism, procedural racism, systemic racism, ideological racism. Institutional racism is any action, policy, ideology, or structure of an institution which works to the relative disadvantage of black people as compared to whites, or the relative advantage of white compared to blacks. Structural racism says that racism involves a form of black participation, either in which black people copy or maintain parallel institutions such as churches, governments, schools, or they are included in the institution in inferior positions. And then when we talk about procedural, systemic, we're talking about sort of the policies and practices that are implemented, which, regardless of the individual, can have an impact that is discriminatory or disadvantages one racial group over the other. And then when we talk about ideological, we're talking about in the mind, right? We're talking about philosophy, we're talking about culture, we're talking about the ways in which different viewpoints subconsciously or consciously can result in distinction between one race or over another, right? But I think the key thing is, I mean, when you look at prefixes and suffixes, right, racism, that ISM, it suggests that there's a system involved. So one person may be racist, but racism itself is actually a system. It's not just an individual action. And so when we talk about that system, we're talking about the various ways in society in which it manifests in that inequality. So it doesn't mean that everyone has a viewpoint where they think one group is better than the other, but just by our mere existence in society, the way that it has been set up, even if that is just from the history that was never corrected, there are impacts as a result of that, which are going to continue to produce outcomes where one group is either receiving more resources or opportunities or advantages or whatever that is over another group, right? So with that in mind, we can start to see some of the everyday deep-rooted racism that still exists in Bermuda today. Shall we get into some examples?
Structurally, we can talk about the public education system and providing quality education and the exposure and adequate funding. She uses a very specific example in terms of when the schools were first set up and how funding was not equally allocated to all of the different schools. In fact, I think it was, what page was that on, where she talked about how essentially it was a few private schools which received more funding of public funds as compared to schools like I think it was the only school at that time, which was Berkeley.
So I mean, we can read the quote. It's on page 11, but the references to the, and I'm going to use this term, the intentional negligence of public education. In providing that quality education, exposure, and adequate funding. Now, I'm not here to say that you don't get a good education in public school. That's not the point. So if you look at chapter 3 of Dr. Eva Hodgson's book, she says education is important in the molding of a society. In Second Class Citizens, First Class Men, which is another book that Dr. Hodgson wrote, she quotes an official report from the 30s, a period during which she says the black community was doing very little protesting. The report proved to be revealing in terms of the government's education policy as it impacted on both the black and white community, particularly at the secondary level and in matters of financial allocations received. So she references that the white schools were Whitney Institute, which received £1,050. Bermuda High School for Girls received £1,149. Saltis received £1,050 and Work Academy received £1,200. There was one black school at the time which covered 60% of the population, and that was Berkeley, which received less than all the others at £975.
Right.
So she says that the government and the white community committed to their philosophy of racism at the time believed that blacks didn't deserve to be educated. And in addition to, if too many of them received an education, there will be no one to do the menial or basic tasks for which the rest of the society, the white community at the time who were dominant, needed them.
Right.
So it's very interesting. I mean, we look at private schools today receiving their head start through public government funding, which is something I don't think we talk about, right?
No.
When we talk about this distinction between private and public schools is how they got started. So from the very beginning, you're seeing here where the black school got less funding,
Right.
and it's still a public school
Right.
or publicly aided, whereas the others got their head start with private funds.
Right.
So
Which goes back into what you guys discussed last episode, where we can't jump into solutions unless we first understand how we actually started, the root cause. Because if there's that distinction or at least a head start, that carries on, and the consequences of that are harder to correct when you don't understand how we got here.
So, I mean, when we're talking about structurally, right, that's the example of, or systemically, we're talking about the funding, the land, the resources, right, the legacy.
Right.
But then there's the attitude, the philosophy, the culture, right? Like,
right.
how is our perception of public versus private been shaped by that history, right? I mean, Berkeley was considered the black elite school, but it was also at one point the only black government-funded school.
Exactly.
And now it's opened up to everyone, and there's this perception that somehow it's been diluted or it's not the same. But have we really taken the chance to really look at how it got started and that history, right? And this is just the example of education.
Yes.
So we're not even going to stay just on education.
No.
I mean, there's other areas in which we can talk about the impact of racism, right?
Right. We can talk about careers and jobs, right? The perception between corporate blue collar versus white collar is perceived that they might have more value than the trades. And the value of people who work in those sectors, the pride that you might see someone carrying who works for international business community versus someone who works in a trade, which is still a very valuable job. But why is there a distinction, right? Where does that perception come from? Where did we learn that?
And these are examples of procedural racism, right? Just in terms of the procedures and the methods that we use to select one over the other in places like employment.
Right.
You have systemically, which is sort of what we think about when we think about, for example, the United States, the over-policing and profiling of black boys.
Right.
Particularly in Bermuda, we still see that persons who live in areas and neighborhoods that are considered lower income, more condensed or compacted. I mean, I know specifically of examples of community workers who've been told directly by police, for example, that if you are living in a certain area, particularly black Bermudian males, that they will be targeted or flagged just by virtue of living in that area.
Right.
These are discussions we don't really have out in public because we're looking at the United States.
Right.
But we have to ask ourselves, how does that have an impact in terms of labeling, in terms of how our black Bermudian males view themselves from the beginning, how they're socialized, how they integrate into the rest of society. So many more examples, right? And then you already mentioned sort of some of the ideological forms in which racism takes place when we look at the corporate sector and the way that we value employment and jobs and the way that our people fit into it. It also trickles into education when you look at public and private schools, the perceptions of how people talk, how that manifests in, whether you sound more intelligent, whether you sound more neutral, whether you sound more quote unquote Bermudian.
Yes.
And we've seen the watering down over just in the last, I would say 20 years of the Bermudian accent. I remember being told when I was younger to talk proper. My accent is not as authentic or firm as it used to be by just subconsciously trying to be understood in a little bit of a different way. And I know for a fact that that has had certain advantages because I can say the same thing in my Bermuda accent versus this, watered down accent, and it'll be received and accepted totally different, right?
Yes.
Also, not to mention, I'm light skinned, and I know if I was saying some of the things that I was saying and I were darker skinned, I would be seen as even more, I've been told I'm aggressive as it is.
Yeah, the level of aggression, perception, how that's received is definitely different. Like you're just saying about how, you have to water down your accent a little bit. And even me, when I have to consciously think about, okay, how am I pronouncing my words? Or if we were anywhere else, like say, for example, in our family homes, and we're saying, pronounce your words, there's a difference in how you present yourself and how you show up in certain settings. And that doesn't always translate directly into, I'm being professional. Sometimes it's deeper than that, right? When we get into, okay, but am I acceptable as a person, showing up as I am with my accent? And there's competence as far as when you come into a workplace, of course, but we do have to talk more about, well, why is it that, okay, if I have this accent, but am I getting the job done? And that when you go further back into education, where does that start from? Where does that stem from?
I love that point, because if we use the Bermudian accent, for example, some people say, well, I'm not talking white, I'm just talking properly, right? But okay, but you can still talk properly and have an authentic Bermudian accent.
Yes.
So I think we kind of use it as a coverall to sort of excuse the fact that actually there's a little bit of anti-blackness and anti-Bermudianness when we do that, because there's totally a way to have your authentic accent and still speak properly, right?
Yes.
But at the same time, like you just said, it's not just about competence or professionalism. There is an element of comfort.
Yes.
I don't want to stand out.
Right.
I want to, appear a bit less aggressive or less street
Right.
or, maybe a bit more international. And there are definitely racial implications to that, right?
Right.
So we have a couple of minutes before we take our mid-session break. But Ciara, you mentioned a little bit earlier, we were talking about how in Bermuda there are still persons that will suggest that racism doesn't exist or no longer exists, in contrast to, for example, the United States or other parts of the world. And so before we take a break, I want us to at least talk a little bit about what we're going to get into when it comes to, let's call it the downplaying of racism, right? Because Dr. Hodgson actually speaks to this point, and she argues that we in Bermuda have historically downplayed the impact of racism, which is interesting, right? Because when you look on the news, there's a lot of talk about how we still pull the race card, and the government is always, talking about race, can we get over it? But Dr. Hodgson actually says we actually don't talk about it enough.
Yes.
But we also don't talk about it genuinely when we do talk about it.
Right.
So she suggests that, we've actually downplayed the impact of it historically. Yes. And I want us to get a little bit into her rationale.
It's an important thing to unpack because it is quite subtle, and it can be kind of pushed under the rug if we let it. And she talks about how Black Bermudians saw racial segregation as one consistent evil. For them, racial integration was the solution. Whites had made it clear that they were hostile to any mention of race or racism. And so at that time, the way to get around that in regards to those who followed the PLP and those ideals, they didn't want to alienate the white community by addressing one issue head on. And so said, okay, how do we get around that? We talk about integration and drive down the talk about direct racism. Let's not talk about it. And the same efforts that were going into that, we said, okay, we have to talk about integration in terms of, instead of, let's say, desegregation, which we talked about before, which is when you go in and you say, what is the law in regards to, say, for example, education? That would be addressing it and saying, if we're going to give public funds to these different institutions, we have to make sure that it's equal. That would be an example of saying, okay, we're going to desegregate the mindset and the approach. Integration then became, okay, we're not going to talk about racism as far as the system itself. we're going to talk about a shortcut to that and saying like everybody kind of come together. Let's not upset the whites.
And so that's a manifestation or an example of racism, right?
Right.
That overt, blacks over here,
Right.
whites over there,
Right.
right? What Dr. Hodgson is saying is because of the impact that had on the black community obviously saw segregation as evil, right? Or
Right.
discriminatory.
Right.
And in response, thought that the solution was, okay, well, since we're desegregated and this is racism, then the solution to racism is integration, right? So the idea that, okay, if we were all just together, right, if we got rid of the separation, then racism will be over.
Right.
That's sort of what Dr. Hodgson is suggesting, right?
Yeah.
And it was comfortable or less uncomfortable to argue that, right, to push for integration as opposed to actually looking at the root causes, right? Because you can end desegregation, right?
Yes.
You can end segregation,
Yes.
and you can have the movie theater with blacks and whites in it, but that doesn't mean that you've addressed the policies, the laws, the legislation, the history, which led to disparate outcomes between racial groups, right? So what she's suggesting here is that black Bermudians at the time primarily focused on ending segregation and not ending racism.
Yes.
And therefore there was this, I guess, misplaced objective where integration was the ultimate goal.
Right.
And so in order to get that integration, racism itself, it took a backseat. It was discouraged in order to avoid upsetting the group that we're trying to integrate with, right? So there was this idea spearheaded, according to Dr. Hodgson, by the black leadership to say, well, in order to avoid inflaming those tensions, right, because we're trying to come together, we're actually not going to talk about the real meat and substance of racism and what that actually means.
Right.
So as Bermuda entered into an era of desegregation and stronger voting rights throughout the 60s and 70s, party politics became the focus of many black Bermudians instead of continuing the push to end racial inequality. And so her critique was that the founders of a lot of these organizations and politicians looked to the West and to Europe further instead of looking internally to Bermuda to develop philosophies and ideals.
Which exacerbates the same systemic problems that we were talking about earlier.
So although we may mention the word race, we haven't actually talked about it. We've just talked about coming together.
Right.
We've talked about the outcome, but we haven't talked about the cause.
Right.
And on that note, I think it's a good opportunity to take a bit of a break. We stopped just before the break talking a little bit about that transition from segregation in the 60s and 70s in Bermuda into party politics. And so we're going to open up the lines for this part of the discussion. The number is 297-1075. But before you call in, we have some questions for reflection for you. And then we're going to talk a little bit about Dr. Hodgson's points when it comes to party politics. So the questions: what is missing from the conversation when we talk about racism in Bermuda? Post-1998, with the election of the PLP, was racism eradicated? What has been the impact of party politics? And, crucially, what has been the impact of party politics within the black community? Has it caused a split? Has it caused division within the black community? Not just within Bermuda generally, but how has it affected black people? So we're going to get a little bit into that discussion. We're going to read off some of Dr. Hodgson's points first, though. So, Sierra, let's go to page 24 in Dr. Hodgson's book. She talks a little bit here about that transition from segregation. Remember, we mentioned that according to Dr. Hodgson, the black community felt that integration was the solution to racism rather than just a response to desegregation. And her critique is essentially that the PLP at the time's agenda politically actually caused some division within the black community. You want to elaborate a little bit more on what she was talking about?
She talked about how the PLP's political agenda advocated for socialism, labor rights, and anti-capitalism versus racial injustices that affected all black Bermudians, no matter their financial status. And that's centered around communist ideals and the universal franchise. This caused a huge divide in the Black community because it disconnected leaders from the issues important to the lower-income Bermudians, and it isolated highly successful and college-educated Bermudians from contributing needed skills to the country because they didn't align with either party. This created fights for personal power and influence instead of a collective effort for racial progress.
I think that's an interesting point because, I mean, when you look at, let's say, justice activists and persons that are anti-racist today, I think we've all kind of accepted an anti-capitalist approach. So, it's still helpful, I think, in the modern day when we talk about all the isms and schisms. You talk about classism, capitalism, all the rest.
Right.
But Dr. Hodgson isn't expressing a position on whether she's supportive or against capitalism here, but she's just pointing out that in her view, the focus on the labor aspect actually alienated what she classified as the upper class blacks from the party and from the Black leadership. And so when you look at the formation of the party, she argues that essentially it caused or at least exacerbated divisions within the Black community because those who were considered upper class Black didn't feel like they could align with those who were of the working class Black.
Right.
What do you think about that in the context today? Because, I mean, when you look at the average young Black Bermudian today compared to the 60s and 70s, and you look at, for example, the amount that have gone to, let's say, private school or university education, the amount that are working in corporate fields, would the average Black Bermudian today identify as blue collar? And if not as much as in the past, what impact do you think that has on the Black Party, the PLP, and its historical agenda of being the party for Black upward mobility? How does that sort of translate into today when you look at the Black leadership and the everyday Black Bermudian, trying to, I guess, succeed in life in Bermuda?
I think when it comes to the average Black Bermudian, as far as the perception of equality, I guess, before we jump into the other couple questions, I would say that the perception as far as upward mobility, there's a narrative that there are certain avenues to success, and I would say that might have used to look like hospitality, the service industry, but I would say now, for the most part, when I talk to different people, that looks like international business, that looks like going abroad to university, and however you fund that, whether that's through scholarships or bursaries, it doesn't look like I'm going to be a very successful plumber, for example, whereas that used to be a very, I would say, prominent or admirable trade, carpentry, to go into. I mean, you talk maybe nursing nowadays is probably the equivalent, I would say. But as far as if I'm going to quote unquote make it, that looks like I'm going to be an underwriter. I'm going to study law. I'm going to do accounting, right? I don't hear anybody talk about I'm gonna be a seamstress. I'm gonna do these trade things with your hands, or just things that are considered a bit more blue collar. What's your second question?
Yeah, I think we can jump on that point because what we were kind of discussing was in the context of the Black leadership back then, post-segregation, right, to the Black leadership now and how they relate to the struggle of Bermudians and Black Bermudians in relation to fighting for equality.
Right.
And I think what you're speaking to is the disconnect.
Yes.
So if we look at, for example, page 24 in chapter 7 of Dr. Hodgson's book, what Dr. Hodgson says, and I'm quoting here, globally, Black societies and nations need advocates to defend Black causes and to fight for justice and equality. Right. She argues that the PLP had the opportunity to be such an advocate, but because of the rhetoric, what was destructive to the Black community was that the story of Bermuda's experience of racism stopped being about the victims of injustice and the struggle for a more just society and became the story of the party and the struggle for a limited number of individuals seeking power and influence within the party. She says that equally as destructive was basically the fact that the political parties generally institutionalized and defended the deep racial divide. How does she argue this happened? She says that conflict caused by the introduction of political parties was seen among the black community because for the black community, party allegiance also meant that intelligent, disciplined, successful black individuals were prevented from contributing their much needed skills and experience to the country when they didn't belong to either party. She also says that challenges to the white community and its racist practices at the time were replaced by conflicts and quarrels between black individuals and their drive for personal power. The struggle for power and influence for the individual replaced the struggle for justice for the now divided black community. And the black community, therefore, had not created their own language. They spoke the language of the master and had not cultivated a sense of their own worth and ability to solve their own problems. They did not value the strength and power of their own collective action. Committees negotiating with the white power structure had always resulted in the least possible success. So she makes some pretty strong claims there in her book, essentially arguing that the political party Westminster system has strengthened the divide between blacks and whites and indeed within the black community. I think we have a caller on the line, and again, the number is 297-1075. Hi, caller.
Hi, guys. To kind of answer your questions, and I'm trying to be as short as possible. I think one thing that is missing from the conversation of racism in Bermuda is like the admission of Bermudians that we actually don't really believe that getting rid of racism is necessary. It's really interesting to kind of see Dr. Hodgson's theology laid out in terms of how she talks about we don't want to talk about racism in order to keep the comforts of like our closeness to whiteness that we perceive that we benefit from integration. And if we were to talk about racism, if we were to start calling out inequalities, like we would ruffle those feathers and then we lose those quote-unquote privileges. And it shows up in the way that we talk about international business.
I was going to ask if you had an example.
Yeah, I think it shows up in the way we talk about independence, like international business. Like, for example, like if we were to put more resources into other areas of Bermuda's economy, then we lose racism. Like if we were to tax them heavier in order to increase, funding for public schools or other areas that will benefit Black Bermudians, then the international business would leave the island. Or if we were to, develop stronger, I guess, like self-determination, then it would drive white people out. And if we drive white people out, then where will we be? So that sort of language, when we talk about actually solving or eradicating and bringing up issues of race, it's like, oh, let's not do it because then we're going to upset white people. And that's something that we have to internalize as Black Bermudians of like, why do we feel that our value is so attached to centering whiteness? Like, why do we feel that we need their approval? We need them to like us in order for us to be able to develop and grow as a people. And then to answer your question about party politics and how it's divisive, I think a lot of young Bermudians feel this way, even regardless of race. But, speaking to the Black community, a lot of us kind of feel this tornness, right? Like all our frustrations with PLP, the direction they've taken, the things that they haven't delivered on. It's this just overwhelming irritation that we have, and it's led us to like a learned helplessness of, well, what do we do now? Because there are those of us who want to get involved on a political level, but our only options are PLP and UBA. And we've already seen how difficult it can be to even form third parties that are able to, first of all, be able to like beat out these two sort of like political giants that we have today. And it's also difficult to even try to establish what it is that we need, because like you guys discussed last week, we haven't taken the time to really delve into how to develop a system that will work for Black Bermudians and will work for Bermudians in general.
I was going to say,
and so
yeah,
it's
sorry, not to cut you off.
been like this kind of like I wouldn't even say it's been an underlying, because right now it feels like it's erupted into this huge problem of how do those of us who are competent, how do those of us who do want to get involved but don't want to align ourselves with PLP, don't want to align ourselves with OBA, how do we then make a difference in our country?
Well, you've given us plenty to discuss with that for the last couple of minutes, so we want to thank you for calling in. I'm going to hop on just some of the points you made on the tail end when you talk about the party politics. Because it's interesting how history repeats itself. In Dr. Eva Hodgson's book, she talks about, just like I said with the quote, about how for a significant part of the Black community, party allegiance and the party system meant that many people who were considered intelligent and disciplined but didn't fall into either party were left out altogether for contributing their skills and experience to the country. And when you talk about sort of third parties, back then, even then, there was a movement to have this alternative, but it was coming predominantly from the white community. So on page 25, Dr. Hodgson talks about the Voters Association, where she says, and quote, "Meanwhile, many white Bermudians who opposed political parties formed a Voters Association, which in truth was a party that was not a party. It outlined a platform, it had representation in the parishes, however, it didn't have a central committee, and it didn't demand complete commitment or party loyalty." And so we've seen here throughout history that you've sort of repeated itself in terms of these people falling outside of the party lines, trying to set up their own thing, not necessarily always with the best intentions. So I want to thank you for the call, and we'll open up the lines in case there's some other thoughts and others that want to contribute. But in the meantime, Ciara, what do you think about sort of the impact of party politics on the Black community?
I think picking up off of what CM was saying towards the end, where you have young people, or people of any age really, who want to get involved on a political level and make a difference. And if they don't align with either party, regardless of if it's an all-Black party or not, if they don't actually subscribe to the ideals of, let's say, for example, PLP, because they're in, you then have to overcome this hurdle of, oh, so what, you're not going to support like your people or your constituency, like we've been voting in this, and like I know people who have families where it's like, we always vote this party. It doesn't matter what the political platform is, and that in and of itself is a form of what they consider to be part of the fight to say, okay, well, we have representation. We use our power in this way by voting for this party because we're putting our trust in these members.
That's our vehicle. That's our horse vehicle that's going to take us where we need to go.
Without taking the extra time to pull back the veil a bit and say, well, how does this party actually work? How does the system that it was birthed out of, how does that serve us or doesn't? And how does it actually impact us long term on a generational level to continue to put our vote towards them or the other party? Because I think that a lot of energy can be spent trying to say, okay, well, if option A and option B both don't work, let's create an option C. But sometimes we overlook the tension, like when we talk about divisiveness in the Black community, sometimes we overlook or we don't fully appreciate just talking about creating an option C as opposed to blindly following option A. That creates tension because it's like, well, what do you mean you're going to create another party? You need to fix what you have so far is the mindset. Like, work with what you have and either join this party or critique them, be an effective opposition, you know what I mean, and go with it that way. Don't go and upset the balance now and create another party because you'll never get voted in. And it's like, well, why don't we talk about changing the system then?
Right, because even option C, is it really, I mean...
How far are you going to get with that?
Options all on the same plate, right? As opposed to how about a whole different plate altogether,
on a plate that you didn't even ask for to begin with. Like, you was given the plate, and as opposed to saying, let's go get a different plate from the cupboard, right? Or let's go make a plate that you and I can agree on and figure out the the issues with that, as opposed to, let me push this food over there because I don't want that on my plate and I don't want this one. It's like, you didn't even get the plate to begin with.
Right. Like, why are we even talking about creating more options within a system that we are accepting is not working, right?
Never designed for us.
So, I mean, you're on point today. I mean, we have a couple more minutes in case anyone else wants to speak to the impact of the party system on the black community specifically. The number is 297-1075. But while those lines are potentially open, I just want to harp back, Sierra, on tying in what you just said with what Dr. Eva Hodgson talks about on page 36 after the PLP victory in 1998.
Right.
Because what you were just talking about was how sometimes we have a tendency to just look at the party itself without unpacking the policies or its philosophy.
Right.
And what Dr. Hodgson says is in November 1998, right, 30 years after its formation, the PLP won its election. And it claimed not to be a black party. And in this occasion, it gained some white votes and a great deal of white funds for advertisements. She argues that the PLP made a decision early that the elimination of racism or the narrowing of economic racial disparity or race relations in general would not be a key guiding principle in their ideology, philosophy, or rhetoric. She argues that by 1998, the sacrifices and that rejection and lack of respect for the early PLP by the white community and the black community had been forgotten. And she says, and I quote, without a theoretical guiding principle or philosophy, it was inevitable that the party would fall back on the personal.
Right.
And so she asks a question, with this emphasis on personality rather than policy, could they or would they adopt educational policies that recognize, for example, the importance of creating and nurturing environments for the many, quote unquote, at-risk black young people? Could they design policies that would ensure that inexperienced black companies would be allowed to be empowered, for example? Would they be able to place a value on those who had challenged racism even before the existence of the PLP? And we sort of see that question even when you look at Dr. Hodgson, and, you know, she passed a few years ago, the way that she was alienated from, let's say, the black hierarchy. She's not even considered a national hero. Not that I believe in the concept, but if I did, she would be one of them, right? So how has sort of that party structure even caused alienation within the black community? I think is a crucial question. But the thing that stood out to me was this emphasis on how post-segregation, there's a lot of focus on personality and individual leaders rather than an agenda or actually some guiding principles.
Which is a natural consequence of when you don't necessarily understand the system that we're in, and you don't necessarily agree with the whole party and what they stand for as a collective. And so what happens is you have to say, well, I trust this person, or I trust this person, but guess what? They're not in my constituency. So to the extent that I want the change or the policy that they say that they're going to implement once they get into power, I guess I have to cast my vote for this person in my constituency who I may or may not really support or believe in or trust. And then you're exacerbating this same issue, which is that the package that is presented to you, or the answer that's given to you, is, okay, you might not trust the person who is given authority over you, but look, we have this person and this person who you can trust. So why don't you vote for the party anyway and trust that it's all going to work out?
A lot of focus on personality.
Or
limited options.
Yeah, and that creates its own issue as far as pressure on those people, unduly so, because if you're working in a party where it's supposed to be teamwork, if it's supposed to be that we're all pulling together our resources and achieving this feat, then what happens when that person doesn't act within the confines of their personality? What happens when they change? What happens when they do something that requires forgiveness or an explanation? Where are you left then?
Brilliant. So, I mean, we're not done with this topic yet. We have a whole nother show where we're going to talk a little bit more about Dr. Hodgson's book, because she had a lot to say, and we can't encapsulate it in just 1 hour. But I think the takeaway here, and it's right here at the bottom of page 36 at the end of that chapter 9, Dr. Hodgson says, long-term structural racial discrimination is so crushing that even in victory, black people, whether right, left, center, financially secure or financially struggling, need to challenge it, or it will never be totally eradicated. And I think that's a good wrap up for sort of what you're speaking to, Ciara, because if we're focused on personality or a particular party or a particular constituency, and we're not looking at that guiding principle or philosophy or that agenda for our community, then it's always going to fall back on, as Dr. Hodgson says, the personal. And so when we talk about the division in the Black community and how party politics manifests, we have to look at that history and that background of racial inequality in Bermuda, and we have to understand it before we jump into solutions and leaders and personalities. So, what are your key takeaways for today's show, Ciara? And then we can wrap up and sort of give people the heads up on what we're talking about next.
My key takeaways from today is that we have to have an understanding of our own, and when I say our own, I mean Bermuda's history and how we got to this point, understanding that nothing was untouched by racism, structurally, institutionally, educationally, ideologically. All of that was touched and then influences how we show up today. And so in order to move forward and to have enough courage to say, well, what are our options, not just within the confines of the systems that are already existing today, but when we look at the larger themes of our club in terms of self-determination and thinking about what does that actually mean, not just within the confines of the ideals that we adopted. It's important to educate ourselves on those things. That's probably the biggest takeaway is seeking that information out, and not just ourselves from books and combination of collections from people like Dr. Hodgson, but also talking to people in the community who live through these things and filling in the gaps, because you and me, obviously, we weren't there during that process. We didn't see what happened. We didn't see the compromises, the conversations, and the conflict that arose from people actually taking action to get to the point where we are today, because there are certain things that we enjoy as a result of those people's sacrifices and those people going before us and making various decisions. But carrying on that conversation so that it doesn't just stop there, but it progresses and we see more actions where we're now coming back and we say, well, let's go for more, let's go to the root. I think that's probably the most important takeaway.
Okay. Thank you for that. So, I mean, some powerful stuff there in Dr. Hodgson's book and in our reflections today. Well done on your first sitting with us at Roose's Book Club, filling in for Simbrit. You're a natural. So, I know you won't be here for the next show, but we wish you well when you go back and continue what you're doing out there in the UK. And when we get back, we're going to talk a little bit more about Dr. Hodgson's book in the context of Chinwezu and moving on to the next book. So for those of you listening, this was episode 3, Roose's Book Club, Radical Heritage. The reflection questions for you as we go in advance of the next show is, how do we define and identify racism in its broader context? What makes racism in Bermuda different from anywhere else? How has Bermudian culture played a role in our perceptions of racism? What has been the impact of party politics and government post-segregation on the Black community specifically, and our unity and the way in which we show up when it comes to leadership in Bermuda? So follow us at Roose's Book Club, ROOSES, ROOSESBOOKCLUB on Instagram, or visit futureleaders.pm/Roose's Book Club. And on those pages, you can find all the books that we'll be reading, all the discussion points, and future show dates. Right. So you can also go on those pages to look at the recorded shows. Yes. So we're on show number 3 now. There's plenty of content there for you to engage with. And I want to say thank you, Ciara, for joining us today.
Thank you,
staff. Thank you to Hott 1075. And of course, this is sponsored by Future Leaders Bermuda, registered charity 1009. So thanks for engaging with us today, and we'll see you on the next episode of Roose's Book Club.